Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Nancy Drew Games review series, where we're ranking every single Nancy Drew game on 6 key aspects, being the story or premise of each game, the suspects, the puzzles, the music, the atmosphere, and the ending of each game. I'm your host, Jameson.
And I'm Julian. What's going on, everybody?
And today we are reviewing Nancy Drew number 24, The Captive Curse.
Alright, Nancy Drew and The Captive Curse is a very well done game, and the Germany part of it, it just nailed it on the head.
Now, make no mistake, it's not modern Germany, or really a reflection of it, or even like 19th century Germany. It's a very old Bavarian kind of Germany. All the architecture is distinctly Bavarian.
Definitely not modern.
There's curves in all sorts of the woodwork, and it's very distinct with the wood that they use and all the buildings. You know Bavarian when you see it, and this game does a very good job on capitalizing on the Bavarian style. This game has a very different beginning from most other games, starting with a cutscene and this somber violin with a caption that says Germany a very long time ago. And it shows a young girl in black and white picking berries from a bush or something and putting them in a basket in the woods. And then we get the perspective of a monster coming out of the forest and chasing her. She runs to the castle gates and drops all of her things and bangs on the gates, begging to be let in, until the hand comes after her out of the dark. She turns around and is whisked away into the night.
If you haven't seen it in our gameplay overview right here, we'll just edit it in real quick. I think it's definitely worth showing how the game starts off. But then other than that really cool cutscene, the actual premise of the game starts with Nancy being called to investigate monster sightings at Castle Finster. She's called in by Marcus Boehm, the owner of Castle Finster, and people have been going on about how monster sightings have started to come up again, which is a huge deal because the last verified sighting wasn't until like 60 years in the past, so this is a very big accusation going around that the monsters come back to Castle Finster.
So, to Marcus Boehm, he doesn't really believe that the monster is real. He just knows that someone is causing problems around the castle and he wants Nancy to put an end to it. But to the townsfolk of Castle Finster and the people who live there, the monster is a very, very real threat to them. There's all sorts of signs that have been passed down from generation to know if the monster's coming, such as cattle mutilations or changes in the weather and subtle things like that. And everybody knows that someday the monster will return, just as the legends always say. And people are starting to think that that time is now.
The story behind the monster is that it's about teenage girls. It's literally Nancy's age, you know? It's like almost, why would Marcus call in Nancy? If the legend has any truth to it, she would be target number one for this monster, which is kind of funny.
Well, you see, the thing is, Marcus doesn't believe in the legend at all, so he just doesn't even put any thought into thinking that Nancy is the perfect archetype for the victim in all the legends of the monsters. But that does have a very, very sinister implication in the end game, which we'll be sure to touch on when we get there.
So in conclusion, the premise is just Nancy being called in to investigate at Castle Finster for what may or may not be monster sightings. And I think a really nice segue into characters is Nancy's arrival to the castle gates. She runs into not one but two characters, and these two suspects happen to be in our top 15 characters of all time. You should go check out that video if you haven't already because they are magnificent. We have Lucas Mittelmeier and Karl the Burgermeister.
So, Lucas Mittelmeier is the first person that Nancy meets, if not face-to-face. Nancy rings the great doorbell of the castle, and there's no response, so she shouts, "Hello, is anyone up there? Hello?" And then a young boy starts to shout back at her from above and begins lowering a bucket with something inside
of it.
"No,
no thank you, we already have one."
Yeah. Look, just right off the rip, Lucas is so goofy. And Nancy shouts off, "This is Nancy Drew, please let me in." And Lucas goes, "This is Lucas, please let me out."
Lucas is by far my favorite suspect of the game, and it's totally fair to call him a suspect, because despite him being like 11, 12 years old, there is still a fair amount of suspicion thrown on his character. At any point, I don't think it's safe to rule him out as the potential culprit.
It should be noted that Lucas lives in a castle, and he has very few friends, and he has way too much time on his hands, and he uses all of that time to just concoct pranks, specifically against Carl the Burgermeister. They have a Tom and Jerry relationship.
That's exactly what I was gonna say. They share that relationship really well, but
Carl's never fast enough to catch Lucas in the act, but that doesn't stop Carl from trying his best.
after a little bit of bickering and having to solve a cheap little puzzle right off the get-go of the game, Nancy is invited into the castle by Carl, and that's where she meets Carl more formally. Together they discuss about the serious monster problem that's going on in the castle, but he's trying to keep it all in the hush-hush.
It should be noted, though, that the reason Lucas doesn't just get chastised at every turn by Carl is that he is pretty well connected. 3 Middlemeyers live at Castle Finster, one of them being his aunt, Anja Middlemeyer. She's the Castellan in charge of all the guest services and staying. And then his father, Franz Middlemeyer, is actually the head of security. So Lucas knows places in the castle that Carl doesn't even know about, secret passages and whatnot. And furthermore, I almost think that Franz might outrank Carl, or at least they're on the same level of status as far as the Castle Finster employee food chain goes. So Carl can't really do a thing about Lucas and his horrible pranks.
So let me get out of the way one of my biggest critiques on the game. Since you already brought up Franz, I just think I'll share this now. I think one of the biggest issues is the game is it is missing a suspect. It's kind of hard to describe, but especially towards the end of the game, it becomes extremely obvious who the culprit is. And I just feel like the game, it would have done it a huge favor had there been just a 5th person to talk to. And it's not like that could have been a stretch. There's multiple mentions of townsfolk named by their names that are living in the courtyard, and Lucas's dad would have made an amazing suspect. I mean, Marcus could have come in. There's a lot of possibilities that would have wrapped up this case a lot better than I think it did.
You see, Julian says that he wishes Franz, Lucas's dad, was a character that you could speak to, or at least call on the phone. I think that a better character would be the briefly mentioned Magda. Magda is an old woman who lives at the castle and is apparently the first person to have sighted the monster since its apparent return. And ever since she saw it, she's been terrified and has locked herself in her room, and I believe you can even identify which door is hers out in the courtyard, and you can knock on it and she just tells you to go away in German or something. But she's mentioned very briefly. Nancy even asks Carl, "Where is Magda? Can I meet her?" And he insists that Magda does not want to be speaking to anybody right now.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that she would have made a nice suspect.
They could have saved on animation. They could have pulled a Game 4 Hotchkiss where she just speaks to you through the door for pretty much all of the game.
But those were just a little critique we had. I think let's dive into Carl's character more because he's super interesting.
Yeah, for the characters that they do have in this game, they are second to none. So Carl the Burgermeister is just as goofy as Lucas, but in a different way. He is so full of himself. I think the funny thing is that whereas Lucas is a child and he's kind of allowed to be goofy, Carl is like a 30, 40-year-old man who's just absolute maniac.
I think Lucas and Carl actually share very similar personalities, but it's almost as though Carl is stuck in a 40-year-old man's body.
Yeah, and that's why they don't get along so well.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, Carl is a very interesting type. The first time you meet him, you walk in on him playing with dolls on his desk, and then...
Hey, you can't... They're not dolls, man.
Yes, the adult set carefully crafted molded place-holding avatars for his tabletop campaign action board game set, or whatever he calls it. Carl's passion is board games, and he proudly states that German board games are the best in the world, and that the best strategic board game engineers are all from Germany, and so many great board games have come from there too.
That's just a really cool bit of information on German culture. I had no idea that board games were taken that seriously over there, and I think that's really cool.
Well,
and to have a character who's like central thing, one of the biggest subplots of the game is developing his board game and testing it out and everything. I think it was pretty cool.
Julian claims he's met people from Germany and have German heritage who take board games very, very seriously.
Yeah, they genuinely do. I think the game got it right for the most part.
Okay, well, that's a bit goofy in my opinion, but I think that it still makes for a fun subplot because you actually get to be one of the test players for Carl's board game that he's submitting to the German board game committee, Raid. And Raid is a fun game. It's like Candyland, but with a strategic extra step where depending on the square that you land on, you have to pick another character to face off with. And you have to just use these cards that you're given, and they're all of like fairy tale characters, and each one has a different statistic for whatever color you're on. It's a little complicated, but it makes for a fun pastime.
It could be one of my favorite ways of making money in a Nancy Drew game.
Yeah, for sure. If you watch our long play, at the end of part 1, we got into a 15-minute game of Raid on the hard difficulty.
It was intense.
It was a banger, man.
But I want to get into why I think Carl is one of the best suspects of all time. And it's because he's super stressed out about, first of all, the monster sightings. He's worried it's going to be terrible for business. He's not going to have anything to support himself if this is actually true that the monster is back.
There is no monster here, Fräulein. Everything is just fine. Go back to normal. We have a huge monster problem, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, he's a creative character. But what I really like about him, and maybe my favorite monologue in the entire game, is when he talks about how when he was 6 years old, he met his doppelganger on the back of a train car that his father had taken him on. And this was another really neat introduction to German folklore, because doppelgangers are a real thing, and like Grimm's fairy tales and everything, a lot of German backgrounds in the doppelganger thing.
This game does feature the second edition of Jane Penvillen's Monster book, and it covers a lot of the German folklores and legends.
But essentially what a doppelganger is it's an identical, almost mirror image of yourself. It's another person dressed exactly like you, but as Carl described, he met this 6-year-old boy identical to him in the back of the train car, and they played together, but the boy never said a word the entire time. Until, I don't know, I assume at the end of the train car ride, his dad came and picked him up, except I have no clue how he was able to
figure out which one was who.
Yeah, if this is true, who was who.
Yeah.
Either way, he picked the right Carl, and he escaped.
What if this Carl is the doppelganger?
Now that's a crazy game theory.
Oh.
But the thing that accompanies meeting your doppelganger is extreme bad luck, and it's not really too sure how long that's supposed to last for, but Carl thinks that he's been cursed ever since he was 6 years old and he met his doppelganger, and he's never been able to live up to his full potential in life ever since that day.
He's apparently had some bad luck in his past. There's an implication that he had a romance or two and that maybe they ended terribly. And he seems pretty convinced that he is cursed after meeting that doppelganger. And he's convinced that he should never bring other people into his life lest they suffer his curse too.
And you can tell that he really takes a hit on his self-confidence. He doesn't want to submit Raid to the whatever official committee that certifies board games. He's sure that he's destined to fail. And
he knows that it sounds silly because when Nancy asks him why he doesn't want to submit it, he says that good things just never happen to me. And he dodges the nub of the situation that he believes he's cursed.
So all in all, Carl is a very, very interesting character, and I love that story he goes on about.
Wrapping up his traits, it should just be noted that Carl lives in a completely different world. He tells Nancy at one point that the castle newspaper will pick up some new scandalous story about him if they find out that he's not happy with the monster situation. And Nancy goes, "The castle has a newspaper?" And he goes, "Well, of course, doesn't yours? I don't really live in a castle." "Well, how do you protect yourself from peasant uprisings?" It's never really been an issue. It's so colorful to just see the worlds collide. Castle Finster and River Heights.
Okay, the other two characters left in the game are Renata the Storyteller and Anja Mittelmeier,
the Castellan.
So, who should we take first? Let's go with Renata.
Okay, so Renata feels... I would say that she's unnecessary in the game, almost. She does have some parts, but the reason why I forgive her, this character has some of the best one-liners and dialogue ever. She has such brilliant quotes, and her character is made out to be an old, wise woman. And that's exactly what they hit. She says some things that I think are genuinely wise.
I don't think it's that she's unimportant. She has a huge part to do with the literal legend of the story and how her sister was the one that went missing.
I'm saying is if I was making this game, I would not have thought to include her.
No, I think it was wise, but I see where you're coming from because the one thing I don't like about her is it's a little too obvious that she's not the culprit. There's obviously not an 80-year-old woman pulling the strings behind this monster thing. I mean, it's like from the moment I started the game, the moment I met her, I could rule her out, which was kind of a disappointment, hence why another suspect would have been really nice, her interactive, but I digress.
So, Renata is a traveling storyteller, one of the last of her kind. Her career is to travel across the European countryside to English-speaking countries, maybe German, I don't know what languages she speaks. And all she does is show up to tourist locations like the Finster Castle, and she tells stories. And they don't say if she charges an upfront fee or if she has a tip jar or something, but that's how she makes her living. She just travels across the countryside telling old stories that she's collected in her times. And
that sounds like an awesome job.
Yeah, honestly, it's too bad that the career is dying out for her. Nancy says to her at one point, "That must be really sad for you that your career's dying." And she says, "No, it is sad for you. I know the stories and you don't."
You know, I just made this connection. Back-to-back games, we've had a very elderly woman suspect.
That's
Takai
true.
and Renata, and I think both of them were... You know what? I'm noticing a deeper connection between the two of them. Both of them had a really big secret they were sitting on, too.
Yeah, that had to do with the past.
That's an interesting trend that her interactive took, but my favorite part about Renata is how seriously she takes the legend, and that's because of her deep personal connection to it. But what I really like is how she watches out for Nancy, and a very specific instance of this is when Lucas pulls a little prank on Nancy and drenches her with a water bucket over her door, and she has to change into these like very Bavarian-styled clothes. And once she changes into the clothes and talks to Renata, Renata gets deeply offended that Nancy has changed clothes and says she won't talk to her anymore unless she changes out of the outfit. And all this was for Nancy's own safety, from her perspective at least. And I just thought that was a nice little look into her character and how she views life.
And once Nancy goes back to her room and figures out that her clothes have been shredded and this Bavarian dress is all that she has, Renata reluctantly declares, "You're part of this story now."
That's one of the creepiest lines.
Renata is just full of creepy, brilliant lines. The first thing that she says is super foreboding, and I think it's just a really ominous touch that does make her seem suspicious, if not kind of ridiculous to consider her a real suspect. She says, "First, I want to ask you something. You are here for the monster, yes?" And Nancy can answer yes or no. Whatever she says, Renata then follows it up with, "Now I tell you something you don't know. This monster, he is here for you."
Mm-hmm.
And that goes into the whole legend of hers, where she believes that every time the monster returns, it's to kidnap and take a young woman back to its lair.
She has a very strong reasoning for this. I think we should jump into her story.
As Renata, in one of her first stories, when Nancy asks her what she knows about the monster, she tells Nancy a story about two young girls a long time ago in Germany, and how they were sisters. And the younger girl was given a scarf as a gift that had come all the way from India and had a parade of gold elephants stitched onto it, and she was very proud that it was hers. One day the wind blew the scarf into the forest, and she ran in after it, and her older sister ran after her because she knew it wasn't safe, and that there were monsters in the forest that night. Two girls went into the forest, and only one came out.
And because of her interactive's really nice storytelling, about 3/4 through the game, we actually find the scarf Renata was talking about. I think it was super cool. And we return it back to her, and that's where the connection's made that there was a truth to her story, that she was one of the girls.
She was the younger girl who chased the scarf into the forest, and it was her older sister that never made it out. Whether or not a monster actually killed Renata's sister, she never says for certain, because she really doesn't know for certain. She was young, and it was dark, and she was so afraid, and she's never forgotten that night ever since. Honestly, it may be what inspired her to become a storyteller in the first place.
Yeah, that was really cool, and I didn't like her character that much up until that moment. But I still didn't think she was a culprit at all.
I remember we were playing this, Julian had forgotten the subplot, and he goes, "What if Renata is the woman from the story?" And I just kept my mouth shut, and sure enough, like 5 minutes later, we got to that point.
Okay.
Anyhow, it's time to get into Anja Mittelmeier, the final suspect and kind of obvious culprit. Now, I say obvious not because she's overtly suspicious, but because by process of elimination, you cannot picture any other suspect in this game being the culprit. Lucas is a little boy, Renata is an old woman, and Carl's just too goofy. He's like Burgermeister Meisterburger from Santa Claus is Coming to Town on steroids.
Yeah, and again, why this game needed another suspect, and it's not like it wouldn't have been bad writing if they threw another one in there, but... Okay, Anja Mittelmeier, she is the Castellan of the castle, and she is just overflowing with friendliness. It's a little suspicious.
Yeah,
She offers Nancy boyfriend advice at one point, and that is my favorite phone contact storyline in this game is Nancy and Ned going through a little bit of a breakup. I think that was a really interesting take that her interactive did for the game. Something original, at least.
Yeah, this is one of a couple games where Nancy and Ned have relationship problems over the phone, probably stemmed by the fact that Nancy is literally never around for Ned and is a terrible girlfriend.
Yeah, we're Team Ned. But anyways, I thought it was interesting that Anja is always there to offer relationship advice. I kind of viewed their relationship as, like, friendly, though I knew she was most likely going to stab us in the back at the end, which she did.
But Anja had an interesting set of motives. Once you do some digging on her file and paperwork and just questioning other suspects in the game, you find out that she is actually Marcus Boehm's ex-girlfriend, and she must be pretty bitter, seeing as he was a very wealthy man, and probably staying with him would have set her up financially for the rest of her life. And also maybe they had a genuine connection. It's never really explored if there was a healthy relationship. All that is known for certain is that it was a pretty harsh breakup.
Yeah, and that breakup is what propelled all of her monster ideas, and it was kind of a really cool idea when it came full circle at the end, but...
We shouldn't get into that till the end game.
Fair enough. All that can be said for now is that breakup is actually the reason that spiraled her into a depression and made her dress up as a monster to get back at Marcus through a pretty cool motive.
Anja's located in the gift shop, and I would go as far as to call it my favorite gift shop in any Nancy Drew, or just a place that you can buy things. It beats Whale World, that's for certain.
Ooh, I don't know that. I don't know.
Oh, it beats Whale World for sure. In terms, you can't even buy stuff in Whale World. Okay, that's an argument for another day. Anyhow, it's a very colorful place. It's a tone shift from everything else, and there's some cool books in there you need to see. And I think that about wraps up her character for now, but we'll touch more on her as the story goes on. But otherwise, I want to touch on one last aspect of this game, which I guess belongs in Suspects more than anywhere else, and that is the phone contacts. This game had... I'm going to go ahead and say it. This is my favorite game for phone contacts in the entire franchise. And I think there's a couple reasons. First, they're overtly charming and fun phone contacts. Marcus Boehm is like a German Elon Musk. And
it's a good comparison.
He's a very goofy dude. He says stuff like, oh, I have 4 houses, Nazi. I have 2 in Berlin, 1 in Austria, and another somewhere. But I assure you that I know what I'm doing and everything. Oh, and also I own a castle, but you know that. And he also, like, at one point, Nancy suggests to him that maybe he could be behind the monster sightings. And he says, are you accusing me of being behind the monster sightings? And Nancy goes, well, it's not out of the realm of possibilities. It is so far out of the realm of possibilities that it's across the sea of ludicrous accusations. And he just starts to go on, and he's just like, ooh, but I admire your thoroughness. He's a funny guy, but... And then there's Jordan from Castle Cast. She's got... what, like an Australian accent, something like that. She's fun to talk to, even if she is a relatively unimportant character. But the thing that really sells phone contacts to this game is that Nancy's cell phone gets terrible reception from Katzelfinster, and she can only use the landline in her hotel room. And the landline is just so pretty and ornate. The woodworking around it's great, and it's just got like a cute little Bavarian house vibe on it. But the best part is that it's situated right next to a window where there's moving animations. You'll see bats and birds fly outside the window, fog rolling in and passing by, and just having a little aesthetic, ambient, visual effect going on during the phone calls every time you make a call really, really sold it for whenever you made a phone call in this game. I think we should go ahead and get into puzzles, which, again, I have very good things to say about.
Yeah, puzzles are great in this game, and I think it's because most of them, I think they're a perfect difficulty.
This game is the perfect difficulty for puzzles. It even offers a hint hotline. This is the first game with an in-game hint mechanic that's not just Bess and George saying absolute nonsense over the phone. And on that note, it does a very good job with hint hotline because it helps you just keep a nice flow of what there is to do in the game and when you can do it. In that regard, I hardly ever even need spoilers when I play this game, because just everything seems to flow so seamlessly from one puzzle to another.
I think my personal favorite of the game is definitely the Glockenspiel puzzle, but it's not just the Glockenspiel. It's actually a series of puzzles that has to do with coding and going around and finding these symbols over the castle. I think it was really cool, and it was really rewarding because it got us access to the security booth, which also threw a slew of other puzzles at us, which were really fun. But no puzzle in this game is like necessarily dominant. I think all of them complemented each other so nicely.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I don't even know if I have a favorite puzzle in this game. It's just that they're all a perfect level of difficulty, and there's nothing that's like particularly game-breaking or grinds you to a halt as far as puzzles go. I like the thing at the bottom of the wells. Normally that takes me a longer time than it did Julian. Julian somehow solved that in like 4 moves when we did that. Oh, and I love the sequence of the game where Nancy has to take a picture of the monster in the brushes to prove that he's still out there.
I like messing around in Carl's room and having to readjust the scales for all of his raid cards, and it was also a nice introduction to the game of raid and getting to know each and every card, which was pretty cool. And then also cracking Carl's code and how it intertwines with raid, the Professor Sparrow picture on the wall. I don't know, there were just a fair amount of puzzles did actually have to do with raid, and I think raid was really clever and unique, so those are 2 words I would also use to describe the puzzles.
We should go ahead and mention too that the board game's theme in this game is not slept on. You have Raid with Carl, which is fun, and then you can also play Monster with Lucas, and Monster is actually a pretty fun game. I'm not sure if it would work well enough with actually playing it with anyone but a computer, but it's a neat concept. It's too difficult to explain over the review, but if you've ever played this game before, then you know how Monster works.
And another thing that I have to compliment puzzles on is it also taught the player a fair bit of German like vocab and folklore and a bunch of stuff like that. Needing to know particular words in German is a central part to the puzzles in this game. We see 3 different decoding puzzles where we need to know German words, and that was pretty cool. A nice little way to intertwine knowledge with gameplay, and I think that's what this game did very good at.
Yeah, for sure. Puzzles, this is a very, very solid game for puzzles, and I would highly recommend it.
And also it just came to mind, I love the series of 3 slider puzzles when we're stuck in between the gates at the monster sighting.
Yeah.
I'm just a sucker for slider puzzles. But let's move on to music now, because music is another amazing part of this game. We're going to be showcasing like 7 or 8 tracks because it's just almost perfect.
I'm going to go ahead and start off with Castle Waltz. Castle Waltz is the most Bavarian piece of music in this entire game. It is... I'm trying to think of how to describe it. It's got a violin melody, but this very, very distinct underlying... Gosh, I don't even know what instrument it is. It's escaping me in my head. It's like an accordion, I think. A really, really low accordion. We'll go ahead and play Castle Waltz right here. It just echoes the whole vibes of the ancient Bavarian castle.
Okay, my favorite track in the game is Girls, and it definitely plays most often in the castle. It's got beautiful strings in it. The violin comes in a couple seconds in as well, and I mean, it's just... Gosh, it's beautiful. I don't know how else to describe it.
That octane piano, though?
Yeah. It's a very common theme in the game, and I just think it fits the German style so well. It's a little ominous, a little sad in a way. I wouldn't go as far as to call it cheerful, but it's just a great track. Here is Girls. Let us know what you think.
My runner-up for second favorite track has got to be... I'm going to go with Spy. Spy is a very good one. It's got a very distinct, suspicious nature to it, with super, super cool eighth notes on the violin, where it's just very abrupt, very rigid, and very, gosh, almost tense, but not in a stressful way. I'll go ahead and play it right here.
Alright, I guess I'll cover another track here. I'm gonna choose Castle. castle, wouldn't you guess it, plays most often in the castle, but if I had to pinpoint a location, I'd actually say it's more so in the basement, the glass smoldering area in the catacombs. And that's because this is a kind of dark theme. It doesn't sound that happy, honestly, and it's got kind of similar to Girls, just beautiful strings that come in, but almost in an ominous sort of tone. Man, I'm so bad at describing music, so I guess the best way to show you guys what I'm talking about is to just play a clip here. Here's Castle.
Now, this game has one of the best, most intense tracks that isn't a danger track. The danger track for this game actually kind of sucks. It almost never plays, and I don't even think it's worth playing. But just make no mistake, the creature track is always just fantastic to listen to. It's got like almost Gregorian chanting in some parts at the beginning. I can't even think in my head of what all the different instruments are that are going on in it, but it just ends up in this really, really intense choir chant of a song that always plays when the monster shows up. Here is Creature.
Okay, the final track that I would like to cover is Forest, and this plays most often outdoors, not necessarily in the forest, but it's another really scary track, and it's got that classic violin that comes in. It's a little slower paced than every other track though, and I think that's kind of just to accentuate how slow and dark things start to feel outside, especially the deeper you go into the forest. So
I'd call it the scariest track in the game.
yeah, I'd say so too. It's really, really well done. So here's Forest.
And that about wraps up music for this game. Such a classic game for music. Games 22 and up tend to have much more detailed soundtracks, I think, but that's not to slight all the games before it, because they do still have some bangers. But these games and up still just tend to have very detailed and atmospheric soundtracks. This game, not one such song in this game seems out of place. They all just scream Castle Finster.
Let us know if you had a favorite track that we played, because I love hearing everyone's personal favorite tracks. I don't know why. It's just reassuring to make sure everyone has the same love for the music that we do.
So now we are entering the atmosphere of this game. Now we want to go ahead and say right now that we're going to include at the end of Atmosphere a brief detail of every monster sighting in the game, because whenever the monster shows up, that gets really intense. But first off, let's go ahead and just start off with what's your favorite place in the game?
The main living room that Lucas is in. I
Really?
love
The foyer?
Yeah, the foyer. The chandelier that hangs overhead, the woodwork on all the walls, the furniture. It's just the simple things that make the castle come to life like that. It feels like a very real place. And there's no specific room per se that it's potentially, there's no specific room that's eye-grabbing. I just think that in general, when I think of the castle, I just think of the entrance foyer and seeing Lucas huddled around his little table playing with monster cards. It's just kind of heartwarming to me.
I actually have kind of a similar answer. My favorite is the junction in between Nancy's room and Carl's office, and Renata's room too, where it's just hallways with the woodworking and all the different banisters on the staircases, the paintings on the walls and the chandeliers and all of that going on. I feel like that is just a really, really pretty aesthetic for them to include in this game. And I think that they totally nailed the ordinary space all throughout the castle.
Okay, so the castle itself is really well done, but atmosphere is also the most conflicted part of the game in my opinion, and it honestly, it brings the game down, and I can explain why. There are 2 locations in this game I think are just flat out bad. And that's one being the underground parts where you have to enter through the wells. It is a horrible dark maze with copy and pasted screens, and it's just so hard to navigate or to gather where you are. There's miscellaneous clues thrown about the floor that are super easy to miss, and I did not enjoy any part of the game down there. You have to gather a couple items and you have to learn some vocab down there, but it just felt kind of useless. There was already a catacombs under the castle, and I get that they were connected kind of, but gosh, not a very nice part of the game. And then the other part, this could be a little controversial, but the forest was not that good in my opinion. It suffered from copy and pasted screens again, and it was way too easy to get lost. That's just my opinion though.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to find your way out of the forest than it is the dungeons, and I think there's cooler things that go on in the forest, like some monster sightings that go on later.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate the forests because of the storylines that happen there, like finding the camp tents and especially taking pictures of the monster. That was super cool, and I really like how they used the forest in that regard. But I'm just saying, as an area, it wasn't that appealing.
Yeah, I can believe that. So, again, there's so much to say about atmosphere in this game. I love the courtyard of the castle too, with the old well that still works and everything. And I like being able to go around all the places, but I think that most of the game can just be explored right here with the scripted monster sightings. So I think we should start off with the first time Nancy gets off the phone with Marcus, I believe. She's immediately met with pounding on her door, and when she opens it, Carl's at the door, out of breath, hands on his knees, going, "The monster has struck again in the courtyard, come quickly." And when you get out there, there is a potted plant on fire.
Yeah, it's like, what did the monster do here?
Exactly, yes.
He smashed through a window, I believe, and he set a plant on fire. We got a real bad boy over here.
He's a pyromaniac. But anyways, Carl is super shooken, and he says, like, "Nancy, I know it's not safe for you to be here. You must leave as soon as you can." And Nancy just does her typical Nancy Drew, "I'm not backing down that easy." And then she just gets a bucket of water out of the well and lights it, puts it out. Fun thing.
This is also where the creature track plays.
Yeah, creature track plays here too. A couple times you hear that track in the game. But fun thing that I figured out in like my second playthrough of this game is that Nancy can use her phone to just take a picture of the burning plant and then set it as her lock screen. It's just kind of funny.
Yeah, that's I think what I did.
I always liked being able to set things as my lock screen in the games with where you can take pictures. But otherwise, you don't see much of the monster for a little bit until you get into the security booth after solving the Glockenspiel puzzle, and you figure out that you can set up your phone for the network so that Nancy now gets security alerts on her phone. And sure enough, after just progressing like 20 more minutes into the game and doing some puzzles, Nancy gets a phone call, and you expect it to just be Marcus, like, "Nancy, it's Marcus, call me back on the landline." But no, it is Castle Security, and this stern voice, who for all we know could be Franz Mittelmeier, just goes, "Monster has been sighted on castle grounds. Monster has been sighted."
Now, I gotta tell you, when first time playing this little 14-year-old Julian, whenever I got that notification, "Monster has been sighted on castle grounds," my stomach dropped. I was bracing for a jump scare. I was shivering. I was a wreck. And I think that was just a really creepy little thing that they did without any mention, without ever seeing the monster on screen. It's just really, I really like the security system and how it notifies the player when a monster attack is happening.
So as soon as Nancy gets this message, she hustles right on over to the security booth and starts checking the cameras when she finally sees the monster is standing in the courtyard by the well. So she runs outside, and sure enough, Nancy shouts, "It's the monster!" And the creature track begins to play.
So
and
logically, what does Nancy do?
the monster stops and looks at Nancy and then walks away out the gate. And she goes, "I don't think it's seen me. I better try to get a closer look." And she just starts running towards the monster, and she's about to get out the castle gates.
You lose complete control of Nancy, too, at this point. It's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
cutscene.
When both castle gates come down in front of her and behind her, locking her in, but thankfully so, because it just narrowly protects her from the monster, who jumps up and growls at her and tries reaching at her through the bars. And that really scared Dad when we played this with him. As soon as Nancy gets the bars up, she picks up a piece of fabric that was snagged at the gate that has a burr on it, and that's a clue about where you need to go in the forest. But she goes, "That was definitely not my imagination." And I feel like that was a really good way of setting the tone for the rest of the game.
And then another, we'll call it a monster sighting, is when you actually catch Lucas in a monster outfit with stilts on. That was another, creepy part of the game. Oh, wait, but it actually does turn into a monster sighting.
Yeah. So that one begins with a much more chilling way. If you thought that monster has been sighted on castle grounds was a threatening thing to get, wait until you get the call that says monster has breached castle security. Monster is inside the freaking castle. So when that happens, Nancy goes back to the security cameras, and she sees that the monster is in the glass blowing room now.
Oh, yeah.
And so she gets down there, and there's a bunch of things overturned. There's some dirt on the floor, and a series of footprints that are leading out up the stairs. And Nancy gets up the stairs, and she sees the silhouetted figure of the monster walk by her. And the closer she gets, she finds Lucas just trips over his own stilts and falls on the ground, and his mask falls off, and what do you know, Lucas is the monster, everybody. And so Lucas keeps on saying, Nancy, you've got to believe me, this is the first time that I've ever done this, I swear. And she's like, oh yeah, tell it to the judge, Lucas. And Lucas would have just been clapped in irons if the actual monster didn't just walk by right outside the window right then. And Lucas goes, oh man, I'm getting out of here.
That was a really cool scene.
Now, one thing that I want to mention that we should have mentioned to Lucas's character is that after that situation happens, there's actually a new dialogue that's accessible to Lucas where he says, hey Nancy, I think I can hear the monster growling outside. And Nancy says, don't worry Lucas, it's just your imagination. He goes, but we know that it's real now, you and I just saw it. And he asks Nancy to stay by and stay close if she can, and you can tell that Lucas is really afraid now, and he wants his friend Nancy to be by his side.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's a good as point as any to jump into the ending of the game, and I really want to talk about Anja Mittelmeier's motives and what her grand scheme was that she almost pulled off.
First, we should talk about the beginning of the endgame. This game has a fantastic endgame, it's paced really well, and it certainly lasts plenty long, where Nancy gets a phone call from Carl, who says, come to my office quickly, something terrible has happened. And as soon as she gets there, Carl goes, it's Lucas, he's missing. And this is really interesting to see from Carl because it kind of shows that despite all the charades that he gets into with Lucas, Carl genuinely cares about Lucas, being that he is a citizen of his castle. I believe that the translation for Burgermeister is Master of Citizens. So he's kind of like the mayor of Castle Finster, and Lucas is one of his priorities to keep safe.
So, with Lucas's disappearance, Nancy finds out that he's being kept in one of the cells in the dungeons under the castle. That was pretty creepy. But then once we try to save Lucas, save the day, lo and behold, the monster comes out of nowhere and drops us through a trap door that drives us all the way through into our own little cell.
We've got to solve a series of puzzles from here, and they're pretty difficult. We have to deal with the legend notes that we find throughout the game. But once, 30 minutes of solving puzzles later, and then getting lost in the catacombs, we have the Culprit Confrontation. Now, this was a very, very cool Culprit Confrontation, because it's the only time since Stay Tuned for Danger that Nancy is given the direct choice to accuse the culprit. If you pick the wrong suspect to accuse being the culprit, you will get attacked and presumably killed by Anja. But if you pick Anja, then she takes off her mask and goes into her motives, and it's actually really sinister. So, after working your way out of the dungeons, you find a second email that's very similar to the ones that Anja keeps stored in her desk at the cash register, which is dated for tomorrow, and it's from Marcus, which means that it must be a fraud. And so, what it essentially says is that Marcus wanted the monster publicity to be staged by the crew working at Castle Finster so that they could draw in more attention and have tourists come by. You know, the classic message in a haunted mansion, spicing up the place by faking the hauntings, Abbey style. But on that note, it's crazy because
essentially what the plan was to have Nancy seriously injured or killed and have it look as though Marcus orchestrated it.
So that way, Anja could get back at Marcus and have his life ruined and have him maybe put in prison even for making him look like he was responsible for the death of a young sleuth.
And to give credit where credit is due, that is a really smart and it sounds like a realistic plan.
But Nancy outwits Anja, and if you use the Freyher's daughter's amulet that you find out in the woods at one part of the game, you can use that as the key to maneuver the trapdoor settings and just open the trapdoor right as Anja's standing over it. And then she's in the classic Shorty Thurmond Nancy looking down on you while she just pleads for help.
That's when the in-game credit rolls, and honestly, I gotta say that ending kind of left me, like, it wasn't that exciting, and I especially didn't like that how obvious it was Anja, and especially choosing anything other than Anja, like, wasn't in-game. It just further propelled the idea that Anja was the one and only, like, possibility for a culprit.
Yeah, I can see that. On that note as well, there are a lot of cool character resolutions in the endgame. Really, everybody leaves Castle Finster. Renata moves on, having seen some justice for now about her sister's death. At least she gets her scarf back. Lucas and his dad Franz leave the castle and they move to the city. Lucas gets friends and writes letters to Nancy and says how he wishes he could play games of Monster with her again. Carl, now that this whole disaster has been resolved, decides that maybe he isn't cursed after all. He submits his game to the board game committee, wins, and then becomes the hot new entrepreneur in the game of strategic board game planning.
That was my favorite resolution. It made my heart so happy to see him be successful for once, and I don't know.
Anja goes to the Stony Lonesome, of course. Too bad for her.
Rightfully so.
And Marcus just carries on with his entrepreneur and crazy industrialist endeavors. And you gotta admire a good man, Marcus Bohm.
I think there's a little snippet about how the stories are going to be altered now so that Nancy is included in them, in the resolution of Castle Finster's monster, and how she's always welcome back to, as she's kind of like a hero in that regard now. So
yeah.
All in all, it was a very wholesome in-game letter.
For sure. So now we ought to go ahead and enter the ranking part of this game. So just to clear things up real quick, the way we like to rank our games is with letters A through F. A being good, F being terrible, and then the S tier above A reserved for the best of the best Nancy Drew games. We've been handing out a lot of S tiers lately, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. This is another one from me. I would personally say that I like this game even more than Shadow at the Water's Edge. While Shadow at the Water's Edge does have just as good of, if not even a better and more sinister story, this one just has a much more fleshed out environment, even if you are limited to the castle and castle grounds. I love the characters. They're a lot sillier and goofier than most other games. The mystery isn't as compelling as Water's Edge. That's just the most recent S to compare it to, really. But overall, the puzzles in this game are spot on, and I loved that I was able to solve them and infer all the answers on my own.
Okay, I guess I'll rate it now, and I've been going back and forth between an A or an S, because it's such a good game, it's either gotta be one or the two. But ultimately I'm gonna go with, this is an A game, and I'm gonna explain why here. I think it's a great game, obviously, but I think what holds it back from being an S is the lack of mystery, as Jamie said. I think it's a little too obvious that Anja is the culprit, and I also think there should have been more foreshadowing that somebody was out to get Marcus. It just kind of seemed like at the very end of the game, things just got thrown onto Marcus, and there was not much development in regards to the breakup Anja and himself had, which would have been nice to learn more about. And also, I can't look past how Lucas's dad was not someone we can interact with, not even a phone contact. He's someone who presumably works in the castle and is always in there at the same time as Nancy, yet he's never on screen. It just feels weird, and he's always the one sending out security alerts. It just felt, there's some weird moments in the game, and you know how I feel about the copy and pasted screens in the forest and the wells too. Just parts of the game weren't as attractive as others, and that's just the one thing truly holding it back from being an S. Otherwise, magnificent storytelling, setting, and music. I love the game.
The best compliment that I can give this game is that if I had a friend who had never played anything in the franchise, this probably would be the first game I would recommend, maybe next to a couple others.
Definitely. I also like to think in the perspective of, this is somebody who's first trying a Nancy Drew game. Excellent game to start off on.
For sure. Well, that concludes our review for Nancy Drew number 24, The Captive Curse. We hope you enjoyed the review, and also we wanted to say thank you again for 50 subscribers. We recently hit that milestone on our channel, and we celebrated it with our top 15 favorite suspects of all time. You can find that video on the channel too if you'd like to take a look at that. Again, it's just our opinion, so don't get angry that we put Lewis Chandler at number 1. But on that note, we hope that everybody is staying safe out there in quarantine as we're starting to wrap it up and reopen the world and economy. Anything you want to say, Julian?
Not much other than the obvious. Vote for Hold, everybody. Thanks very much for listening.
Vote for Holt.